Hello again, and it is my honor to introduce a good friend of mine and ministry partner, Dr. Lawrence Watts, or Larry Watts as we call him, is a board-certified family physician and graduate of Loma Linda University School of Medicine. He completed his residency in family medicine at Loma Linda University in Loma Linda, California. He's been involved in medical evangelism his whole life. He focuses on accountability and building relationships with governments and teaching potential missionaries on safety, health, culture, and medical challenges. He's involved with many ministries supplying medications and serves as the medical director of Global Medical Outreach. And I can tell you personally that this is a man that has for years and years and years ministered in countries all over the world, including some very difficult places. God's given him open doors in places that others couldn't get into, places where pastors were no longer allowed, or even some medical missionaries were no longer allowed. He was able to get into because of his strong standard and because of the things that he does. I know he's distributed millions and millions of dollars in medication to different places around the world, including during the Ebola crisis several years ago, which makes him especially helpful during this time when we're dealing with another pandemic and epidemic. And he has been great wisdom from the very beginning of the COVID crisis. I know that we had the opportunity to share with people about some of his early ideas, which I don't know what the number is, but I would say upwards over 90% of what he recommended early on is now becoming the wisdom of how to treat this serious situation. I just wish everybody could get on the same page with this, as I'm sure all of you do. But he said he won't tell you this probably, but he has had tremendous success, even with elderly patients, even with patients in crisis, getting them through COVID because of the early and frequent treatments that he's given them when many people weren't giving treatments at all. So God has given him special wisdom in dealing in so many different areas. But most of all, I can tell you, if he wasn't a medical doctor, he'd probably be a preacher because he loves the Word of God even more than he loves medicine. He means a lot to me. He is my personal physician, along with, I think, about 45 other pastors, and is a wonderful, wonderful friend. So, Dr. Watts, would you please come and share with the people today? Oops, sorry.
Highest respect for him, and I wish I. Oh, yeah. I was saying that it's very humbling, and Rodney knows as my value to him as a pastor and as a friend that hold him in high esteem, and someday we need to explain his background. Some of it's so much above what you could even imagine. I think I leaked it out that he was IT trainer for the Clinton administration, but he was involved in things beyond that that would probably be he'd rather me not mention. But anyway, we were very fortunate that he got called by God to come here, and he took a hit financially. And it's one of the things as a Christian and where we come from, that if our goal is finances, it'll direct us in a path, or if our goal is Christ, it's going to direct us in another path. So we got to be careful how we set our goals. And Jeff had a great presentation, and we actually have a connection. It was kind of interesting for several to say that we have a connection back in California. I'm also involved in hospice, and we're both talking about light. And it's kind of interesting how everything overlaps. But yeah, the title that we gave in mind was From Darkness into Light. The impact of light on outcomes in healthcare setting. I've got things that could go heavy into science, and so we got probably 20 to 30 lecture hours that we'll kind of condense in a short, just quick overview, really. But when we look at light, there's a lot of parallels. Our Creator created us in an image of science. We think science is constantly disproving God, but if we could speed up the purpose, if we could find God first, we can study science through the creation that He intended us to be. And there's so much foolishness that we've wasted our time in science trying to prove our own way. And so one of the things that we found out, and wanted to start on this subject light, this is a little bit on the science side, but I won't bother you with the details, but I do have over 100 different articles that I can pull up if somebody's interested in some of these research articles. But so if we look at the first slide, I don't know if that will that flash up there? Well, maybe we don't have the first slide. Should I just go on? Oh, it's on their screen. Okay. And can I tell which one we're on? I'm not sure if I have a monitor.
We can't
Okay,
see that
Is
screen
it just
from,
the image one?
we can't see the
The text.
screen
Oh,
on,
just outline, you mean? Okay, all right. And so if we could go to the next slide, that would be the image. And of course, part of this is kind of an overview of maybe what we want to focus on, which Jeff had really talked about. Oh, there it is. Bring your light and restoring presence to dark places in our life, and bring your hope to hearts that feel defeated. Bring your love and compassion to those in pain. If we want to study the science and behind that, that's kind of our goal. The idea of how am I going to help my patient? You know, Pastor Lydia talked about whole person care. You know, I was kind of raised through several different avenues. One was Oral Roberts University. I was part of the healing team scholarship program where every doctor that was going to graduate from there was going to be a medical missionary. It, of course, did close down. That center became Cancer Centers of America. That was the City of Faith, not the university, which is still standing. And then, so the next option was Loma Linda University, which happened to be the university president was actually the first dean that helped establish the School of Medicine at ORU. So I don't know if any of you knew that, but and so there's a lot of emphasis on this more than we think. 110 of our medical centers now have expanded into whole person care, which means that they're delving into the spiritual causality of what's happening out there. If we ignore the spirit of man, we're ignoring a big chunk of what we are. You know, that's probably the most important part of who we can be or who we are and who we exemplify. The rest is basically a body that carries us to God's purpose. And so if we have 110 medical centers that finally over the years drifted from 30 just about 30 years ago to 110, you know, even the world is discovering there's a spirit man. And if we could go to the next slide, please. One of the key findings that we found in studying light is how it impacts health and performance and enabling us to perform tasks at a much higher level than we could otherwise perform. And the circadian rhythm, which I think everybody could imagine what that is about. Now, as we study it, there's a lot more to the circadian rhythms. I'm just going to mention briefly something about that. Melatonin is one of those, and I'll bring that up later, but affecting mood and perception, and these critical chemical reactions in the body. And some of those that I'll mention briefly include fighting cancer. So there's scientific data on these issues, most of which we're so slow to progress on. Like, I was on an international study about high flow oxygen, back in April and May, and it's taken a year for many of our hospitals to transition to that, even though we knew that the survivability was so much greater than being on the ventilator. We were creating human compassion because it is so painful. If you have time to watch one of our recent things that we posted on Vision of Unity, it was actually a plea from a pastor who lost several of his family members to COVID and wanted us to talk about the questions of vaccine. But during that experience, we had a gentleman of 42 who's permanently disabled right at this point because of COVID, who struggling for every breath. He was describing what it was like. So we had a choice of putting him to sleep. We had a choice of keeping him awake and have him struggling with high flow oxygen and living a higher chance of him surviving. And he chose that for 16 days, struggling every minute of the day, trying to take the next breath with it hurting painfully. So some of the things, sometimes we do things that we think are helping people and we hurt them. We just don't realize. If we remove everybody's pain, is that a good thing? I think there's a lot of instances where that has not been a good thing. Maybe in our opioids, which is a challenge in hospice. I don't really concern myself as much in hospice as I do outside of hospice, which is where a lot of problems come in medicine. So the other things that we think of as complex tasks and visual performance and so forth. And I mentioned briefly on there also that age requires enhanced light also to function. And so the circadian rhythm, which I'll bring that up again shortly, but decreasing the length of stay in hospitals. See, now we're getting into a financial aspect. Then those aspects of spirituality, faith, placebo, man would call the placebo effect. Now it impacts man in a financial way. Now we can get the world to listen. And that's, in fact, what has happened. We actually have scientific studies about spiritual pursuits that have allowed us to go forward and actually influence non-spiritual institutions to pursue this. But otherwise, easing pain and performance transitioning, we used to call it the graveyard shift, transitioning shifts, or the one is a rotating shift, probably one of the least healthy ways to do things. You're almost better off to work 16 hours a day than you are to work 8 hours rotating on a constant basis, trying to shift your life. And of course, the presence of windows in workplace, natural light, and so forth. If we can go to the next slide. Let's see if we're on the, I don't know if it's the same. If they can see that on there. But anyway, studies generally suggest that daylight is not always totally superior for all performance of visual tasks, in every case. But however, when we look at natural light, there is benefits over electric light sources in regulating circadian rhythms and maintaining overall health. So there's an aspect of God's creation. We look at it as cancer inducing or producing, but actually there's health. And we can think of maybe in our current dilemma would be this virus. We know that African Americans, 82% are vitamin D deficient. We know that Hispanic just under 70 and Caucasian around 40. And we now know there's threefold risk of death for the average African American age-related death risk ratio. And so part of that is vitamin D. We actually have several studies showing that if you're 20 or less, 80% higher mortality. If you're above the 50 to 100 range, 93% less hospitalization, far less death. So we're seeing a lot of things that God created, and his natural light versus our indoor light. Our color of our skin even has an effect when we're designed for being outside. I always hated being pale because I was an outdoor kid, a farm kid, sunburn easily. And I just hated it growing up. I found my first positive thing here was vitamin D. I can convert vitamin D faster than somebody that has a deep dark tan. So that's my big advantage. But as a kid, being an outdoor kid, that was always one negative thing. I just wished I was raised as somebody darker. One of the things that we can say in conclusion, there's another, be the next one, that we can say that light is critical for health and well-being of patients as well as staff in healthcare settings. We stay in the isolated fluorescent tube or now turning into the light emitting phases of different kinds of electricity, the generated light. Natural light should be incorporated. We know that there's a health related issue and that affects our mood and our function during a while. So we've got actually scientific studies. If the next one, if we could move. So I'm going to tell you, this one has several, this can't quite see the whole thing on there, but there's highly credible evidence that melatonin mitigates cancer at the initiation, progression, and metastasis phases of cancer. So it's an interesting study, and there's several studies, many studies, if you want to pursue it. We actually use melatonin in the treatment of COVID. I don't know if you knew President Trump was treated with melatonin. If you go to the Frontline Critical Care Coalition, I'm part of that research group, by the way, if you want to look at it. Don't blame me if ivermectin and other things become embarrassing. We're studying everything, not just something that gains money. Most of the stuff we're studying is cheap, which is different when you have a financial incentive. And plus the rest of the world can't afford it. So we need to help the world. So I am part of that. I'm not embarrassed what we're doing. We want to do pure science. We got 60 positive studies, 2 not so positive studies. So we'll see what happens with that one. But we got lots of other things we already got data for. But if you didn't know, we have 3 eyes. In a way, we're kind of a cyclops because our third eye is kind of centrally located, and that's called the pineal gland. And that actually, was that an accident? What is the function of that third eye? It senses light and day. And it's part of how we produce melatonin. And this melatonin is an interesting subject because there's not only to mitigate cancer and look at other things, but we're finding out the timing, God's timing. If we have too much light, like if we have continuous light while we're sleeping, when we're supposed to be sleeping, that actually can restrain some of that production. The pineal gland is not producing some of the forms of the melatonin. And on the other hand, if we stay in pure darkness, guess what? We become very unhealthy and we cannot fight off cancer. We know that that's a negative thing, to go in a corner, turn off the light, and pull ourselves away from the world. And so that sometimes happens with people that are depressed, just like in some of the experiments that we had with the rat that was in a cage, and we stimulated the floor with electricity and kept on cranking up, see if he could get faster and faster getting out of his dilemma. And then we closed the gate. And when he finally gave up, we find him in the darkest corner of the cage, rolled up in a fetal position, just shaking and quivering. It's such a close equivalent to what we see with humanity. When we give up, that can be us. There's people around you that have done that, some to the extent of taking their own lives. And those are the people that we want to rescue. They aren't in the light, maybe in more ways than one. You know, we're talking about parallels that God created. And so if you want to go to the next couple of slides, most of these are just some papers and things. There's just a handful up there. There's 100 different articles if you want to see them, but right now we don't have enough time here. In fact, I may be running out of time. I'm not sure. Let's go back to down to a solid dark slide if we can. Anyway, the slide, it's just a statement. It says, light is the shadow of God. And so there's a lot of interesting things to think about how a shadow would be light, you know, but the intensity of God's light, but yet he gives us tranquility and calmness of the night too, to rest, to recuperate, regenerate. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I just kind of liked that when I saw that. So I wanted to share that with you. But a couple of statements, and you probably recognize a couple of these. Life isn't just about darkness or light, rather it's about finding light within darkness. And remember, there's always parallels to how we live, just like how he designed our kingdom and how the parallel of what a family is all about. We need to restore that family, about preparing for the bride. We've lost that, and we're going to lose humanity in the process. We're going to lose the light, which ultimately is what I'm going to get to. What is light? Darkness cannot drive out darkness. This is Martin Luther King. Only light can do that, right? Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love could do that. I thought that was, to me, that was one of his most famous statements that he had. If we can move to the next one. What is the value of our Christian light to the world around us? And within that, you know, most of us have talked about, at least in the Christian circles, and more as humanity learns that there is a spiritual side of man that we're losing out, and even our colleagues that are not pursuing Christianity are figuring that out in our universities that aren't portraying Christ. And this is a best-selling author, Dr. Jampolsky, Out of Darkness into Light. And of course, it was about inner healing. And for some of our patients, we probably should look at that as a priority of study in our life. How do we direct them? You know, I had two of my most favorite parts of medicine in a lot of ways. I enjoyed children and delivering, but one of them is when I see someone coming to the kingdom, and it was the ICU. People that are really close to death are really open to God. Now, a lot of my colleagues did not like the ICU. I mean, it's complex, it's risky. You've got to stay up on everything you do because of a little mistake. It's hard to make a mistake, and I guess that's why I enjoy peds once in a while too, because most of the kids, I couldn't hurt them enough to cause a major harm, making mistakes. But some of those lives that are in the balance, it doesn't take much to flip their life and be lost. But I think challenge all of us as healthcare providers to look at that aspect of what really is inner healing. And that's a big, long subject that could take several hours and maybe at some point that might be worth it to our group to show interest in that area if we have people interested in it. This next one right after the Out of Darkness, wanted to talk about just a little bit, and we'll try to get close to closing here. I'm not even sure what time it is. Let me see. Probably this is down from my call here. Oh my goodness.
You have 8 minutes left, Dr. Watts.
I get 5 minutes?
8.
8 minutes? Okay, great.
You can go a little longer if you
that.
want, because
time goes so fast because I knew there was a lot of stuff I couldn't stop with the scientific explanations on anything. Why do we prefer to perform double-blind studies with placebo in the highest quality, most trusted scientific task? And I've always called the placebo effect the faith effect. But man has just tried to inoculate it with just some kind of a benign process that happens. But if the placebo effect is that strong that over 30% of our symptoms can be relieved by believing that something's going to work when we know that there's no scientific evidence that could work, that's a pretty strong effect in my way of looking at it. And so it's kind of interesting how we pursue life and we try to figure our way to wind around using descriptive terms such as faith or getting to spirituality or God. But if we look at what is the Christian light to the world around us, I think we have to first start with faith. And I think that placebo effect, if we want to call it placebo effect, I'm willing to accept God's placebo effect, faith. But it starts with a quote from Jesus in Luke 17. That'll be the next slide. Or I think, or is it? No, that's the right one. And if you had faith even as a mustard seed, every one of us grew up in Sunday school hearing that story. And my teacher actually had a little bottle with a single mustard seed in it. I don't know if any of you had that experience. But may you be uprooted and thrown in the sea, and it would obey you, commanding the waters. Of course, we know Christ did. When Peter decided he was going to stop looking at him and staring at the waves, and he kind of redirected his attention. And so faith really is the confidence what we hope for will actually happen. And so as a Christian, are we at that point in our life where we've actually walked out in faith that we believe what we're reading in the Bible? We believe what we're saying about the Bible. Do we actually live and experience the faith of the Bible? And that's a challenge for every provider. And that's only going to happen if you have a personal walk with Jesus Christ. It's not going to happen by accident or a casual relationship. And the deepest relationship with a husband or wife is not going to happen without investment of time. If we could go to the next slide. One of the things that we have next to look at is hope. Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all around us being darkness. And so we always say faith, hope, and then we go to the next slide. Is hope we might describe as the fuel that keeps faith alive in our quest to find love. One leads to the next. And the purpose of love in First John, let's see. Oh, yeah, okay. Here we are. Oh, they're ahead of me. And it says, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God, and everyone knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. That should be a powerful statement to us when we find things other than love cropping into our thought process, into our anger and our temperament, and our emotions are carried away. Do we see somebody because he's attacking me? Is there true love all the way through? I have some politicians. It's really tough for me to find true love right now. And all of us have people that we know that it's really hard, but we've got a tough job. But if we figure out God has already accomplished that with us, he loved us when we've been disobedient for thousands of years. He gave us everything and we've thrown it away. We pursued our own self-interest. Even his own creation, Satan, managed to accomplish that and had the universe at the tip of his fingers and threw it all away. So if we can find this purpose right here, and this is, I think, where we culminate and we can find what real light is about. So the purpose of love is twofold. First, it is the revelation of identity. It tells us who God is and who we are in God. 1 Corinthians 13:3, three things will last forever. That's a pretty big promise, isn't it? Not too many other things will last forever in this world, that's for sure. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these, of course, is love. And he always has interesting numbers. I always follow his favorites. 3 and 7 are a couple of the biggies, but he has a few others that we don't study as much. But so is there scientific evidence to support our faith? What do we call lack of faith? So one of the things that we might say is fear, anxiety, lack of assurance, worry, emotionally charged descriptions of lots of other things. So when we worry about something that we can't change, what are we really accomplishing? We're kind of destroying God's creation. So when we find the physiology of mankind and animal creation, we have things called cortisol, which cortisol wakes us up in the morning. About an hour before we wake, our blood pressure starts to build. We have things called epinephrine, norepinephrine. We use those in coding situations, but those are designed for when the bear is chasing us. But if the bear is chasing us all day long, every day, we're going to have some problems on there. And so we actually have some studies about this. And I think I put a statement in the last days, men's hearts will fail them. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. When we use epinephrine, norepinephrine, we cut off vital circulation to vital organs, increase blood pressure, increase heart rate. We depress our immune system with high constant course of cortisol, which we like taking steroids constantly. So here's a course of faith studies of non-believer that evaluated research of many studies. There's more than 180 that I'm aware of, the scientific studies on faith. Some of them were performed by atheists trying to disprove. There were some that were somewhat neutral, and there were some Christians that actually proved. But it's kind of interesting how the atheists summarize. They usually discount everything, but then they get to the numbers. They say, well, we probably got to consider things. Well, this particular assumption that this doctor, who was not a Christian, he said 57% of our trials showed a positive treatment effect. Thus, there's evidence that merits further study. But he wanted to explain himself not to really believe too much right yet at this point, even though we were achieving a p-value of 0.001. Now we're ready to approve medicines when we have a p-value of 0.05, and that's only a chance on 1 out of 20. This could happen randomly. Let's go down one more. So if we don't have faith, there's increased risk of cancer. We have 2 large studies on this, by the way. Age adjusted 1.13 or 13% higher risk of cancer Cancer-specific mortality is 1.21, 21% above baseline risk, and all-cause mortality from cancer is 24%. So this is what we have to gain when we live a life without faith. And I think we got some more studies now. And I have, if we want to go down to life has dark moments and out of his darkness, that's a kind of a picture. Okay. Is it up on for the audience? Okay. So in closing, there's a couple of things that I would just like to say. Are there any witnesses to death? Many of us have even probably read some of the books. You know, I have some examples here, a couple different ones. Even a doctor that came to the Lord after his patient was being coded, and that patient saw things that he couldn't have seen from his vantage point. He could see chemicals in the IVs that were being pushed, what people are doing. And he was unconscious at the time. There were no eyes open. And when he described that, it so moved that doctor that he became a Christian after that experience. So we have a number of things we've seen. We also have a description where darkness supersedes. And if any of you have ever seen or read the book on 23 Minutes in Hell, and the story is he wakes up at 23 minutes after 3, screaming his lungs out, to his wife right next to him, with their ears getting blown out. And he has about a 2-hour program to describe, but it so moved him, he went on the road telling everybody, warning everybody about what it was like. He said, if you can imagine a place that was eternally dark, you're in such pain, hurting, like your body is burning up, but you could look down and you could still see you had remnants of your own hands and arms, but all you heard was people cursing. There was no attributes of God. That statement right there led me to believe that's got to be the worst place that you could ever be. There was 0 attributes of God in the place that he experienced. And of course, that shook up his life, and it became ministry. It was actually a real estate. Let's see if we can go further on here. I'm going to skip all the way to my last statement here. When light enters a dark room, darkness instantly vanishes. Darkness cannot exist where light dwells. Love is the light. So when we look at light and darkness as a Christian, the parallels all come back to love every time. So that's the one thing, if we ever become cynical in what we're doing, we feel like we're too tired, too overworked, we've got to always refocus and refocus and refocus and come back to that. Yeah, I think back again, you know, my hospice times and the times that I've been challenged with patients dying and losing their life and slipping away. You know, did I do everything that I could to try to offer them the ultimate healing, that's eternal life with our Lord and Savior? But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watts, for that presentation. Before we let you off the podium, though, we do have a couple of questions. What's going on? It seems like I'm echoing.
Oops, sorry about that. I guess we're having a little issue with the glitches in our system today. Shagun, would you mind? Are you there, Shagun?
Yes, I am. Yeah, thank you. So I guess there are a couple of questions.
Questions, yes.
One of them was actually asked by myself, and I'm just going to read it out here. So, well, I guess I should ask Ethnas first. Ethnas says research states that night shift healthcare workers have many health problems. Can you address that, please?
In regards to
Yes,
light
yeah,
and
that
dark.
actually comes back to some of the studies on melatonin. We've actually studied those people, the night care workers, but even the workers that are transitioning, going to PM shift, nighttime shift, daytime shift, and rotate. Some places will do that on 2-week intervals, and that actually has been shown to be harmful. And part of that has to do with the protection effect of the melatonin. So we got several studies that you can look up, and I can provide you. Actually, there's some basic studies on this film. I couldn't put the whole abstract on there, but just pieces of it would actually be on the slides that I have to demonstrate that. But a lot of those were thought to be related to cortisol issues, which is, of course, part of our fight or flight response, and also related to melatonin. And so one of the things that we saw, melatonin, we're going to cause ourselves problems if we're sleeping and we have continuous light. We interrupt part of the effect of melatonin. The other one is that we have continuous dark and no alternating light. And we have another effect that we lose from melatonin that actually affects our immune system. In fact, that's part of the things that has been looked at as an adjunct to chemotherapy. So we have very strong evidence about cancer treatment using that. I wish we could have all of our universities stay open to all things. We like to simplify it to something we can make, and say that something that is a matter of man's manufacturing is the source, and it has to be something that we can sell. But there's a lot of things that we can learn from God's nature that He created within us, and so. But yeah, most of it translates back to those areas. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. The next one is, does melatonin help? Because in relation to cancer, does melatonin help because the patient sleeps better? In other words, do cancer patients still need melatonin even if they sleep well?
Yes, there's several aspects with the cancer patients. Some of them sleep a lot more than normal, and so there's loss of cyclical amounts of melatonin that are part of that. So there's two different theories on part of how that works, and there's a depletion aspect of it that happens also with the pineal gland during cancer. So there's but the studies are pretty strong. It's not just well-being, which is some of the first assumptions, but they're very strong data on there. In fact, we're some of those are out there with any other approved FDA drug that we've got on the market. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but we need to. It has drawn the attention of numerous researchers. So you'll be able to find a lot of research. I'm not sure how quickly we adapt to the research, because there should be strong enough evidence right now. You'll see in these COVID protocols, just like the president, melatonin was actually part of that. We saw survival rate was different, and people that were taking that. Of course, there may be the counterpart. One of the risk factors was cancer, too, also. Just like, for instance, COVID risk, since this is kind of current, we had two risk factors for young people that have died from COVID. One of them was obesity, but the other one was anxiety disorders, which we talked about. So that was the second most common cause of death in COVID for younger people dying for COVID. Kind of surprised it was ahead of diabetes and some other things that we thought. So we've got a lot to learn for sure.
Yeah, obviously. Thank you very much. And there's a request